At 55 years old, Kid Rock did something most rock stars his age would never dare to do. He stood up in front of cameras and called out one of the most untouchable names in American music history. Not with a diss track, not with a subtle jab buried in an interview. He came out swinging, straight at Bruce Springsteen, the man millions call the boss. And the wildest part? This wasn't some manufactured beef for headlines. It came from something real, a live, ongoing collision between two icons who represent two completely different Americas. So what actually happened here? And why did it blow up the way it did? Let's get into it. To understand this clash, you have to go back to a single night in Manchester, England, in May of 2025. Bruce Springsteen, 75 years old and kicking off the European leg of his Land of Hope and Dreams tour, stepped up to the microphone and did not hold back. He told the crowd that the America he loved and had spent his whole career singing about was, in his words, currently in the hands of what he called a corrupt, incompetent, and treasonous administration. He didn't stop there. He asked the audience to rise up with him, to raise their voices against what he described as authoritarianism, and to let freedom ring. It was a direct, unmistakable shot at President Donald Trump, delivered not in some quiet interview back home, but on a stage overseas, in front of a foreign crowd. That last detail, that Springsteen chose to say this outside of the United States, became the spark that lit the whole thing on fire. Within hours, President Trump fired back on his social media platform, calling Springsteen highly overrated, saying he never liked the man or his music, and describing him as a pushy, obnoxious jerk. The president didn't just stop at insults either. Days later, he publicly floated the idea of investigating Springsteen, along with several other celebrities, over allegations tied to campaign contributions from the 2024 election. What started as one artist's comment on a European stage had, within a week, turned into a full-blown national story. That's where Kid Rock entered the picture. Just 2 days after Springsteen's Manchester comments, Kid Rock sat down for a television interview and didn't mince words. When asked directly what he thought about Springsteen's remarks, he responded by accusing Springsteen of suffering from what he sarcastically called Trump derangement syndrome, a phrase that's become shorthand in certain political circles for accusing someone of being irrationally hostile toward the president. But Kid Rock went further than that. He called Springsteen's outburst a punk move, arguing that Springsteen was attacking a president who, in Kid Rock's view, works incredibly hard for the country and whose administration is doing good things for America. It was blunt, it was unfiltered, and it was exactly the kind of no-holds-barred commentary Kid Rock has built his public persona around for years. Springsteen, for his part, didn't back down either. Just a few weeks later, during a tour stop in Liverpool, he doubled down on everything he'd said in Manchester, repeating almost word for word that the administration was corrupt, incompetent, and treasonous, and again calling on the crowd to stand against what he described as authoritarianism. That second round of comments seemed to be the final straw for Kid Rock. In a follow-up interview with conservative commentator Benny Johnson, Kid Rock let loose with an even sharper response, using blunt, expletive-laced language to tell Springsteen to stop acting the way he was acting. He also suggested that Springsteen's real motivation wasn't political conviction at all, but rather a desire to stay in good standing with Hollywood's cultural elite, essentially accusing the boss of performing outrage to protect his image among industry insiders rather than expressing something genuine. Now, to really understand why this back and forth landed the way it did, you have to look at who these two men actually are and how different their paths to stardom have been. Kid Rock, born Robert James Ritchie in January of 1971 in Romeo, Michigan, built his career on defying categories entirely. He mixed rock, hip-hop, country, and southern rock into something that didn't fit neatly on any radio format, and that unpredictability became his brand. His breakout album, Devil Without a Cause, released in 1998, turned him into a mainstream star with hits like Bawit Daba and Cowboy, songs that blended raw rock energy with rap cadences years before genre blending became fashionable. Offstage, his image has always leaned into tattoos, trucker hats, and an unapologetically brash attitude, a persona that has made him a favorite among fans who feel overlooked by the traditional music establishment. Politically, Kid Rock has been one of the most consistently vocal celebrity supporters of Donald Trump since well before the 2016 election. and that alliance has only deepened over the years, including public appearances and events alongside the president. Bruce Springsteen's story runs in almost the opposite direction. Born in 1949 in Freehold, New Jersey, Springsteen broke onto the national scene in the 1970s and built a career defined by narrative songwriting rooted in the lives of working-class Americans. Albums like Born to Run, Darkness on the Edge of Town, and Born in the USA became cornerstones of American rock, filled with stories about factory workers, small towns, and the struggles and hopes tied to the idea of the American dream. Over decades, Springsteen earned the nickname The Boss and cultivated an image built on sincerity, hard work, and a commitment to causes like labor rights and veteran support. Unlike many rock stars of his generation, he has never shied away from using his massive platform to weigh in on politics, and he has been consistently critical of Trump and conservative policy for years, making his May 2025 comments in Manchester less of a surprise and more of a continuation of a pattern that stretches back a long way. What makes this particular clash so striking isn't just that two famous musicians disagree. It's that they represent, almost symbolically, two very different versions of what it means to be a voice for real America. Springsteen's music has always leaned on a kind of collective, communal identity. Shared struggle, shared hope, a working class bound together by common experience. Kid Rock's brand, on the other hand, leans hard into individualism, rebellion against perceived cultural gatekeepers, and a rougher, more confrontational patriotism. So when Kid Rock stood up and pushed back on Springsteen, it wasn't happening in a vacuum. It tapped directly into a much bigger, ongoing argument in American culture about who gets to claim authenticity and whose version of patriotism actually counts. There's another layer to this that a lot of casual observers missed at first. This wasn't the first time Springsteen and Trump had crossed paths publicly. Their history of friction stretches back years, with Springsteen criticizing Trump's rhetoric and policies well before the 2024 election even happened. So when Springsteen opened his 2025 European tour with sharp political commentary, longtime fans weren't shocked. They recognized it as part of a consistent pattern rather than some sudden, out-of-character outburst. What changed this time was the intensity of the response it triggered, and how quickly other high-profile figures jumped in to either defend or condemn him. The speed of that escalation is really what turned a routine tour opening speech into a full-blown cultural moment. It's worth pointing out just how unusual it is for a sitting political figure to respond this directly and this personally to a musician's commentary. Most public figures tend to let these moments pass without direct engagement, understanding that punching back at a celebrity critique often just amplifies it further. But Trump has never operated by that playbook, and his willingness to respond in real time on his own social media platform, with personal insults aimed directly at Springsteen, guaranteed that the story would dominate entertainment and political news cycles simultaneously. That's part of what makes this different from a typical celebrity spat. It wasn't just two famous people trading barbs. It was a sitting political figure, a legacy rock icon, and a MAGA-aligned musician, all pulling the same story in three different directions at once. It's also worth noting that Kid Rock and Trump weren't the only ones who jumped into this. Musician Neil Young publicly weighed in as well, siding with Springsteen and pushing back directly at Trump, reminding him in a public post that elected officials work for the public, not the other way around. Meanwhile, Trump's team leaned into the conflict too, at one point sharing a digitally altered clip poking fun at Springsteen, which only added more fuel to an already heated online conversation. What had started as a single comment on a stage in Manchester had, within weeks, pulled in multiple public figures and turned into one of the more talked about celebrity political flashpoints of the year. The reaction online mirrored exactly what you'd expect from something this politically charged. Springsteen's longtime fans rallied behind him, framing his comments as a continuation of decades of honest political engagement from an artist who has never pretended his music exists outside of the real world. To them, Kid Rock's attacks looked less like principled disagreement and more like an attempt to score points with a specific political base. On the other side, Kid Rock supporters saw his comments as refreshingly direct, a willingness to say out loud what a lot of his fans already believed, that Springsteen, despite his blue-collar image, had become disconnected from a large portion of the country he claims to represent. Both sides dug in, and social media did what it always does with moments like this. It amplified every angle, turned quotes into clips, and kept the story circulating far longer than a single interview normally would. News outlets covering the story split roughly along the same lines as the public did. Entertainment desks framed it primarily as a celebrity feud worth tracking for its shock value, while political commentary shows treated it as another data point in the broader story of how Hollywood and the music industry relate to the current administration. That dual framing is part of why the story had such staying power. It wasn't confined to one section of the news cycle. A viewer could encounter it on an entertainment segment one night and then see it referenced again on a political talk show the next, each time reframed slightly differently depending on the audience. There's also a financial and career dimension to consider here that rarely gets talked about directly. Both artists have enormous, devoted fan bases, and public political stances like these carry real risk. Springsteen has weathered political controversy before and has generally seen his core audience stay loyal, even as some listeners have grown more vocal about wanting him to separate the music from the messaging. Kid Rock, for his part, has built such a consistent brand around his political alignment over the past decade that moments like this one function almost as brand reinforcement rather than risk. His fan base largely expects and even welcomes this kind of commentary from him. In that sense, neither artist was taking much of a gamble by speaking out. Each was, in his own way, playing directly to the audience that already supports him. Underneath all the headlines, though, this dispute says something bigger about where American music and celebrity culture currently sit. For most of rock's history, artists could weigh in on politics without necessarily becoming lightning rods for it. But that's changed dramatically in the last decade. Now, when a musician of Springsteen's stature speaks out, it doesn't stay contained to music journalism. It becomes national news within hours, gets a presidential response, and pulls in other celebrities almost automatically. And when someone like Kid Rock responds just as loudly from the opposite side, it reinforces just how thoroughly entertainment and politics have merged in the current media landscape. There's no more just staying in your lane for major public figures. Everything gets absorbed into the broader political conversation almost instantly. It also raises a harder question about legacy and relevance. Springsteen has spent 50 years building a reputation as a moral voice within American music, someone whose opinions on labor, class, and democracy carry weight precisely because he's been saying similar things since the 1980s. Kid Rock, meanwhile, has spent his career positioning himself as the guy willing to say what other artists won't, using bluntness as both a personal brand and a political statement. Neither man backed down through this entire exchange, and neither seems likely to in the future. If anything, their positions only hardened as the back and forth continued through the summer. What this moment ultimately reveals isn't really about who won the exchange, because that's not how these things work. It's about how deeply divided the cultural landscape has become, to the point where even something as simple as a rock concert can turn into a proxy battle for much larger national arguments. Springsteen and Kid Rock aren't just two musicians who disagree. They become stand-ins for two entirely different visions of what patriotism, authenticity, and cultural authority look like in modern America. And as long as that divide exists, moments like this one are going to keep happening. Whether it's these two specific artists or the next pair of public figures who find themselves on opposite sides of the same national argument. There's a broader pattern worth sitting with here too. Over the last several years, more and more musicians have found themselves pulled into political commentary, whether they sought it out or not, simply because the platforms they perform on have become so massive